Greetings, students. My name is Mr. Little, and in this History Bite today, we're going to look at Chapter 17, Part 1, that is Nomads in World History. So, by the end of this History Bite, you should be able to answer these essential questions. How did the nomadic way of life shape their perceptions of political organization? And how have the nomadic relationships with settled agriculturalists been influenced by geography throughout history? Now, I know that Chapter 17 mostly focuses on the Mongols, but in order to get a better idea of how the Mongols ran their empire, we have to talk a little bit about how nomadic societies tend to organize themselves in the first place. So first of all, where are nomads and what are nomads? So nomads are groups and or cultures that do not build settlements, do not practice agriculture, and while they might herd animals, not all nomads are herders. And what's most important perhaps is that their identity is based more on kinship ties. Again, family over, say, language or some individual leader. Right? Where do you find nomads? Well, you usually find nomads in places that is not favorable, places that are not favorable to settled agriculture. This is steppe land, which doesn't have a lot of water, deserts, which don't have a lot of good soil, and frozen wastes, which are just not climatically inclined to grow agricultural crops. Some places where you have found or still find nomads to this day include the Sahara Desert, southern Africa, and the northern part of Eurasia. That's the north of Norway and the north of Finland and parts of Siberia. You still find nomads today. So, that doesn't mean nomadic societies have never had states, and there have been a number of them throughout history. They usually take the form of confederacies, such as the Xiongnu Confederacy or the various Berber states that existed in the Sahara Desert. And these are usually a collection of nomadic tribes that center around one very charismatic leader. Right? Because nomadic societies don't have inherited titles such as king or emir or caliph or sultan or raja. They also don't tend to have organized religion. They don't have temples because they don't build settlements. So because they lack traditional justifications for rule, a leader has to prove themselves. And that's why nomadic states tend to be relatively rare. They need a leader to prove them and overcome those kinship tie divisions. This also means that those few nomadic states throughout history don't have many written records. So we don't tend to know a lot about them. And what we know about them tends to come from other people who wrote about them. So what do we know about the Xiongnu Confederacy? Well, we know a little bit about them, but it's because of things that Chinese people wrote down, not what Xiongnu people themselves wrote down. So it's kind of a problem in world history. But the lack of bureaucracy or normal institutions that hold up empires means that nomadic states can be very unstable. And sometimes the death of a charismatic leader means the end of the state or the end of the confederacy. Nomadic society, however, on the whole, it is worth noting, was a lot more egalitarian than that of agricultural society. In nomadic societies, everybody contributes to the work to gather food or the work to create items for trade. Men hunted and women might have gathered or cared for the animals, but everybody contributed to the production of food. Whereas in settled societies, you have classes of people who do not contribute to the production of food. And we see this even today. I'm not a farmer. I am a teacher. It's not my job to produce food. Nomadic societies, everybody produces food, and so everybody gets a share of the food. And so, in a way, it's much more egalitarian. It's also worth noting that women at the time had many more opportunities in a nomadic society than they would have had in settled societies. In nomadic societies, sometimes you saw women warriors. You had women who had greater control over their domestic affairs. Divorce was famously allowed in the Mongol Empire. Wives were not simply given to husbands like they were in some parts of the world. There was a certain amount of choice that was allowed. Although there was also the practice of bride kidnapping, which while sometimes was just an elaborate ritual, sometimes was also actual kidnapping. Genghis Khan's first wife was famously kidnapped by some of his rivals, but we'll talk more about that later. You did have female leaders in nomadic societies, such as Tamiri, who fought against the Persians in 400 BCE, very long time ago, but this is just one of the more famous ones because she killed the founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great. In terms of nomadic religions, they usually centered on the natural world, right? And because they didn't have established religions, they didn't have a priestly class, but they did have shamans who could commune with nature and commune with the spirits. Shamans sometimes used hallucinogens, but not always. And shamans, there was no rule about who could become a shaman and who couldn't. Usually a shaman was acknowledged and respected by their society based on their ability to communicate with the gods. And while there may have been many gods and many spirits, there was one god for most of the nomadic peoples north of China and in Central Asia called Tengri, which was the great sky god. And there was also a corresponding earth god. But Tengri was perhaps the main deity in nomadic steppe religions. Now, that said, many nomads, as they came into contact with the settled societies of Eurasia, they did convert to some of the more established religions, such as Islam, Buddhism, and sometimes Christianity and Manichaeanism, which we haven't really talked about. But Manichaeanism is sort of it's a religion that's kind of broke off from Christianity, although it still has some elements of Christianity in it. Now, how do nomads get along with settled societies? How do nomads get along with agricultural societies? Well, it is a mixed record historically. There's a record of symbiosis, of living together well. Nomads often traded with settled societies, animal products, which nomads had, for finished manufactured products, like the settled people had. Most famously, the Chinese emperors would accept trade from nomads, such as horses or animal skins, and in return, they would give them silk and beautiful porcelain. And nomads themselves often did trading. As nomads were masters of adapting to their environments, they were often some of the earliest traders to go beyond their trade zones, such as on the Silk Road. And sometimes nomads would serve in state militaries. The Tang dynasty famously relied on Uyghur nomads to help reassert their authority during a series of revolts near the end of their dynasty. And so sometimes nomads would serve in state militaries. They would usually be paid as mercenaries, but they did serve. That said, it's not always been, sunshine and rainbows. There is also a history of antagonism. Nomads often saw settled societies as a source of very easy wealth, and their prowess in mounted warfare usually gave them an edge over settled societies' militaries. Settled society, by contrast, often views nomads as very uncivilized, right? They don't farm. They don't have an organized religion. They do whatever they want. They let their women ride horses. These are not civilized people, and you see this again and again in European descriptions of the Mongols, and Chinese descriptions of the Mongols, and Islamic descriptions of the Mongols and other nomadic groups. There's this air of uncivilizedness. And sometimes as settled societies grew throughout this period and into later society, as they pushed further and further into nomadic heartlands, there was often a lot of conflict over land that settled people wanted to use as farms, and nomads insisted that they get to keep as their grazing and pastoral land. There were a number of notable nomadic migrations throughout history, but for the sake of this course, we're only going to really talk about two of them, and one of them is the Turkic migrations that took place between 700 and 1200 CE. Now, we've talked a lot about the Turkic peoples already, but initially the Turks were captured slaves by the Abbasid Caliphate as it expanded east into Central Asia. And initially they may have been slaves for labor, but over time, as more of them were captured and as more of them just moved into the Abbasid Caliphate, they became sort of soldiers. They became a group of slave soldiers that would be loyal only to the Caliph himself. And this became a very important part of the Caliphate's military. Unfortunately, these slave soldiers also realized they had a lot of power, and a lot of them eventually sort of took control of the Abbasid Caliphate. While they kept the Caliph himself in power, they ran the show behind the scenes. And probably the most famous example is the Seljuk Sultanate, which basically ran the entire Abbasid Caliphate for about 200 years. These Turkic nomads also expanded the reach of Islam into the parts of the Byzantine Empire that the Abbasids had not already conquered, specifically Anatolia. And I've mentioned this before, but the notion of being a holy warrior, or a ghazi, against a non-believer was a great motivator, some might say an excuse, for Turkic nomads to continue to fight and gain loot or territory against non-believers. It also goes without saying that the Delhi Sultanate of South Asia was also a Turkic state. And so these Turkic nomads, as they moved into the Abbasid Caliphate, began to sort of pick up the pieces of the weakened caliphate and form their own Turkic states based on military power and violence against non-Muslims. So I hope you can answer those. So you should be able to answer those essential questions. Thank you so much for joining me on this History Bite, and I will see you next time.